The silence wasn't supposed to happen in an airport, but there it was, thick, heavy, spreading through Gate 12, like spilled water across stone. Passengers mid-stride suddenly slowed. Conversations died even the constant hum of announcements seemed to pause, as if the entire terminal had drawn one collective breath and forgotten to exhale. At the center of it all, a woman stood frozen, her hand pressed against her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief, staring at something just beyond the security checkpoint that had made her world tilt off its axis. The black duffel bag hit the polished floor with a sound that shouldn't have carried over the airport chaos but somehow did. It landed with the weight of 8 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days. The weight of missed birthdays, empty dinner tables, and bedtime stories told 2 photographs instead of sleepy eyes. He had dropped everything. Literally, his military uniform. Pristine moments before, now wrinkled as he broke into a run that looked nothing like the disciplined march he'd perfected overseas. This was raw, desperate, human, the kind of sprint that happens when your heart recognizes home before your mind can catch up. The crowd parted without thinking, forming a corridor of strangers who suddenly understood they were witnessing something sacred. Some reached for their phones, others simply stood transfixed, feeling their own hearts crack open at the sight of love, refusing to wait another second. But what they couldn't see yet, what would make this moment sear itself into their memories forever, was the small figure who had just spotted him through the crowd, the one whose world was about to explode with joy. What happened next would stop an entire airport in its tracks. Staff Sergeant Michael Chun had been counting days like a prisoner counts scratches on a cell wall. 267 days since he'd kissed his 6-year-old daughter Emma goodbye at this very airport. 267 mornings of waking up to sand instead of her giggles echoing down the hallway. The deployment to Afghanistan had stretched longer than anyone expected. What was supposed to be 6 months had become nearly 9 months of missing everything that mattered. Emma's first loose tooth. Her school play, where she dressed as a sunflower. The night she learned to ride her bike without training wheels, wobbling down their driveway, while he watched through a crackling video call 8,000 miles away. His wife Sarah had sent videos, photos, voice messages, but technology could never capture the weight of Emma's small hand in his, or the way she smelled like strawberry shampoo and playground dirt after a long day. It couldn't replicate the feeling of her falling asleep on his chest during movie nights, her breathing slow and trusting against his heartbeat. The uniform he wore carried more than just his rank and decorations. Sewn into the breast pocket was Emma's drawing, a stick-figure family holding hands under a crooked house, with "I miss you, Daddy" written in purple crayon. The paper had been folded and unfolded so many times, the creases had worn soft. His fellow soldiers had learned not to comment when they'd catch him staring at it during quiet moments between missions. Sarah had planned this surprise for weeks. She'd told Emma they were just picking up. Grandma from the airport and necessary, a lie to protect the fragile heart of a 6-year-old who had learned young what disappointment felt like. Emma had stopped asking when Daddy was coming home after the 3rd lot return date. The light in her eyes had dimmed slightly each time, and Sarah refused to let it happen again. But Emma had been different this morning, restless. She'd insisted on wearing her favorite dress, the yellow one with tiny daisies that Michael had bought her before he left. "It makes me feel happy," she'd said, smoothing down the skirt. She'd also grabbed her stuffed elephant, the one that used to smell like her father's cologne but had long since faded to just love and worn fabric. Now, as Michael's boots echoed against the terminal floor, that same little girl stood 30 feet away, clutching her elephant to her chest. She was scanning the crowd with those serious brown eyes she'd inherited from him, the eyes that had looked too old for her face in their recent video calls. She hadn't seen him yet, but she would. And when she did, the entire airport would understand what love looks like when it finally comes home. The empty chair at their dinner table had become a monument to absence. Sarah had stopped setting a place for Michael after the first month. It hurt too much to stare at unused silverware every night. But Emma had never stopped saving him a piece of whatever dessert they were having, wrapping it carefully in foil and placing it in the freezer for when Daddy gets hungry. Their refrigerator had become a museum of missed moments. School drawings addressed to Daddy in the Army. Report cards with gold stars that Emma would hold up to the camera during their weekly calls, pressing them against the screen as if he could reach through and touch them. A photo from her school's father-daughter dance, where she'd gone with Grandpa Joe, both of them smiling but with a visible sadness around the edges. Bedtime had been the hardest part. Emma had developed a ritual that broke Sarah's heart every single night. She would arrange her stuffed animals in a circle around Michael's pillow, keeping it warm, she'd explain. Then she'd whisper her day's events to his photos on the nightstand: what happened at school, which book they read, whether she remembered to brush her teeth. Sometimes Sarah would catch her asking the photograph questions and waiting for answers that never came. The deployment had stretched their small family traditions thin as wire. Pizza Friday became just Friday. Movie nights felt hollow without his running commentary. Even Emma's favorite park had lost its magic. She'd stopped asking to go on the swings because they're more fun when Daddy pushes me high enough to touch the clouds. Sarah had learned to be both mother and father, but some shoes were impossible to fill. When Emma's bike chain came off, she'd stared at it for 10 minutes before quietly saying, "Daddy would know how to fix this." When thunder scared her at night, she'd crawl into bed, not with Sarah, but with Michael's old army sweatshirt, burying her face in fabric that barely held his scent anymore. The video calls had become lifelines and torture simultaneously. Every Sunday at 3 p.m., their time 11:30 p.m. his, they'd gather around Sarah's laptop. Emma would have prepared a list of things to show him: lost teeth, new drawings, dance moves she'd learned, but the connection was often poor, his image pixelating just when she needed to see his face clearly. Morita non se. The call would drop mid-sentence, leaving Emma staring at a blank screen, calling, "Daddy, Daddy." 2 digital silence. Michael had missed her losing that first tooth by 3 days. Emma had placed it under her pillow with a note: "Dear Tooth Fairy, can you take this to my daddy? He wanted to see it." The next morning, she'd found $1 in a note in childish handwriting that Sarah had spent an hour perfecting. "Emma, your daddy is so proud of you. Love, Tooth Fairy." Emma had kept that note in her treasure box, next to the Purple Heart medallion Michael had sent her from his first deployment. The hardest moments were the spontaneous ones when Emma would run to tell him about something exciting, only to remember he wasn't there. When she'd set an extra place at her tea party out of habit, when she'd wake up from nightmares calling for Daddy instead of Mommy, because something deep in her knew that his voice was the one that could chase away the darkest fears. But Emma had also grown stronger in ways that amazed Sarah. She'd learned to help with groceries, to comfort her mother when the loneliness got too heavy, to be patient when other kids complained about their dads not buying them toys. "My daddy is protecting people," she'd say with quiet pride. "That's more important than toys." This morning had been different, though. Emma had woken up actually humming for the first time in months. She'd eaten all her cereal without being asked, had picked out her clothes without the usual indecision. When Sarah mentioned their trip to the airport, Emma had clapped her hands together. "Maybe we'll see soldiers there," she'd said, her eyes bright. "Maybe one of them will know my daddy." If only she knew that the soldier she'd been waiting for was already walking toward them through the crowd. Michael had memorized every crack in his barrack ceiling during the sleepless nights. While his fellow soldiers dreamed of home, he lay awake calculating time zones, wondering if Emma was having breakfast or getting ready for bed. The 8.5-hour difference meant that, when his day was ending, Hers was just beginning, and somehow that made the distance feel even more impossible to bridge. His footlocker held treasures more valuable than any metal. Emma's drawings were carefully preserved between cardboard, each one dated in Sarah's handwriting. There was the purple elephant she'd drawn after visiting the zoo, the rainbow house where we will live forever, and dozens of stick figures labeled Daddy, wearing what looked like green blobs, her interpretation of his uniform. His favorite was the one where stick figure Daddy was flying in an airplane toward a stick figure family with arms stretched wide. Coming home, she'd written in wobbly letters. The other soldiers had learned to respect the small rituals that kept him anchored to home. Every morning, he'd read Sarah's email from the night before, usually containing photos of Emma's latest adventures or videos of her practicing the songs she was learning at school. He'd watch these clips on repeat during his breaks, memorizing the way her face scrunched up when she concentrated, the gap where her tooth used to be, the way she'd wave at the camera as if he could wave back. The hardest part wasn't the physical danger, it was the emotional helplessness. When Emma had fallen off her scooter and needed stitches, he'd stared at his phone for hours, desperate to comfort her, but reduced to sending heart emojis across an ocean. When she'd had her first nightmare about monsters, Sarah's text had arrived in the middle of his patrol. She keeps asking when you're coming home to check under the bed. He'd spent the rest of that mission carrying a weight that had nothing to do with his equipment. His letters home had become desperate attempts to stay relevant in his daughter's rapidly changing world. He'd write about the stars in the Afghan desert, how they reminded him of the glow-in-the-dark constellations they'd put on her ceiling. He'd describe the mountains, comparing them to the hills where they'd gone hiking last summer. But words felt inadequate when what he really wanted was to be the one reading her bedtime stories, not just the voice on the other end of a crackling phone line. The surprise had been Sarah's idea, but keeping it secret had nearly killed him. During their last video call, when Emma had asked her usual question, "When are you coming home, Daddy?" he'd had to lie. "Soon, sweetheart. Very soon." The word tomorrow had been sitting on his tongue like a live grenade, and he'd had to end the call early to keep from exploding with the truth. The journey home had been a blur of connecting flights, time zones, and customs lines, but also a growing storm of anxiety. What if Emma had grown up too much? What if she'd forgotten how his voice sounded in person instead of through a screen? What if 9 months had been too long, and he'd become more stranger than father? His reflection in the airplane window had shown him what Sarah and Emma would see first, thinner than when he left, with new lines around his eyes and a scar along his jaw from a training accident he'd downplayed in his emails. Would Emma notice these changes? Would they frighten her? But as he'd walked through the airport terminal, carrying his duffel bag and Sarah's carefully orchestrated surprise, something had shifted. The familiar chaos of civilian life, crying babies, hurried business travelers. The smell of coffee and fast food had started to dissolve the soldier and reveal the father underneath. With each step toward baggage claim, toward them, Michael Chun had been transforming back into the man who knew exactly how to make Emma's pancakes into butterfly shapes and could recite Goodnight Moon from memory. And then he'd seen them, Sarah first, scanning the crowd with that focused intensity he loved about her, and Emma, his Emin, her yellow daisy dress, clutching that beloved stuffed elephant, completely unaware that her world was about to change forever. That's when he'd dropped his bag and started running. The moments before recognition are always the longest. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Michael weave through the crowd, still 50 yards away. She could see him clearly, the familiar determined set of his shoulders, the way he moved with purpose, even in civilian chaos. But Emma was facing the wrong direction, distracted by a service dog working its way through the terminal with its handler. "Look, Mommy!" Emma pointed excitedly at the golden retriever. "He's working! We can't pet him, right? Because he's helping someone." Her voice carried that earnest tone she used when she wanted to prove she remembered important lessons. She was being good, being patient, being the thoughtful little girl Sarah had raised her to be during these long months alone. Sarah's throat constricted. In 30 seconds, maybe less, their careful world would explode with joy. But for now, Emma remained blissfully unaware, swinging her stuffed elephant by one worn ear while humming a song from school. The same song she'd been humming all morning, as if some part of her soul had sensed what was coming before her mind could understand it. Michael was closer, now close enough that Sarah could see the exact moment he spotted Emma. His pace stuttered for just a heartbeat, and his hand flew to his chest as if someone had punched him. Even from this distance, she could see his mouth form the word Emma, though no sound reached her. His eyes never left his daughter as he resumed his approach. Slower now, drinking in every detail of the little girl who had grown 3 shoe sizes in his absence. Other passengers were beginning to notice something unusual. A businessman looked up from his phone, following the trajectory of Michael's intense focus. An elderly woman paused mid-conversation with her husband, her maternal instincts recognizing the particular quality of desperation and love that was radiating from the approaching soldier. A young mother instinctively pulled her own child closer, as if proximity to this much raw emotion might overflow onto her own family. The terminal's ambient noise seemed to shift, conversations dropping to murmurs as more people sensed the electricity in the air. It was like the moment before lightning strikes that charged stillness when nature holds its breath. Airport announcements continued over the speakers, but they sounded distant, muffled, as if the universe was turning down its volume to make room for what was about to happen. Emma was still facing away, now crouched down to retie her shoeless, one with the yellow ribbon that matched her dress. She was taking her time with it, tongue peeking out in concentration the way it always did when she was focused. Sarah watched her daughter's small fingers work at the knot and felt time stretch like taffy. Every second was simultaneously too fast and unbearably slow. Michael was 20 feet away now. Sarah could see the tears he was fighting, the way his jaw clenched with the effort of staying composed. His uniform was wrinkled from travel, his hair slightly disheveled. But to Sarah, he looked exactly like the man who had kissed them goodbye 9 months, gone somehow completely transformed by everything he'd carried in between. 15 feet. Emma finished with her shoelace and stood up, brushing imaginary dust from her dress. She turned slightly, scanning the crowd with those serious brown eyes, still looking for Grandma Jo, who existed only in their necessary fiction. 10 feet. Michael slowed to almost a stop, as if approaching something sacred that might startle and disappear if he moved too quickly. His breathing was audible now, despite the airport noise, controlled breaths of a man trying not to break down before he could reach what he'd been dreaming about for 267 nights. 5 feet. Sarah saw the exact microsecond when Emma's peripheral vision caught movement in military colors. The way her head turned, casual at first, then faster as her brain began processing what her eyes were seeing. The stuffed elephant slipped from her fingers. 3 feet. Emma's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes went wide, then wider, as if she were trying to take in more light, more reality, more of what couldn't possibly be real, but was standing right there in front of her. 2 feet. Michael's composure finally cracked. "Emma," he whispered, and even though the word was barely audible, it carried across the terminal like a prayer finally being answered. 1 foot. Emma's face crumpled, and the sound that escaped her part sob, part laugh, part scream of pure joy was the sound of a heart that had been holding its breath for 9 months, finally remembering how to beat. The entire airport stopped moving. "Daddy!" The word came out as a whisper, then a question, then a declaration that shattered every heart within 50 feet. Emma's voice cracked on the single syllable, as if her 6-year-old throat couldn't contain the magnitude of what she was seeing. Her hands flew to her cheeks, tears already streaming down her face, before she'd fully processed that the impossible had become real. Michael dropped to his knees on the cold terminal floor, his uniform bunching around him, his own tears falling freely now. "Hi, baby girl," he managed, his voice thick with 9 months of stored-up I love yous and missed good nights. His arms opened wide, the same gesture Emma had drawn in countless pictures. Stick-figure arms stretched towards stick-figured daughters, across oceans of white paper. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, they stared at each other. Emma's face cycled through a dozen emotions: disbelief, recognition, joy, and something that looked almost like anger. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice small and confused. "We're getting Grandma. Joe, Mommy said ... Double quotes her sentence trailed off as her 6-year-old mind struggled to reorganize everything she thought she knew about this day. "I know, sweetheart. We wanted to surprise you." Michael's voice broke on the word surprise, as if he were only now realizing how inadequate that word was for this moment. This wasn't just a surprise, was the reconstruction of a family, the healing of a wound that had been bleeding for 267 days. Emma took a tentative step forward, then another, as if approaching something that might disappear if she moved too quickly. Her yellow daisy dress swayed with each careful movement, and Sarah noticed that her daughter's hands were shaking, actually shaking with the effort of processing so much emotion at once. "Are you really real?" Emma whispered when she was close enough to touch him. Her small hand reached out, fingers trembling, to touch his face, tracing the new scar along his jaw with the reverence of someone handling precious glass. "You feel real. But I dream about you sometimes. And in my dreams, you feel real too." Michael caught her hand in his, pressing it against his cheek. "I'm real, baby. I'm really here. I'm really home." Each word was deliberate, spoken directly into her palm, as if he could transfer the truth through touch alone. That's when Emma finally broke. The sob that tore from her chest was primal, raw, the sound of a child's heart that had been holding itself together, with hope and birthday wishes finally allowing itself to shatter with relief. She launched herself into his arms with the faith that only children possess, the absolute certainty that Daddy's arms would catch her, would hold her, would never let her go again. Michael caught her mid-leap, lifting her against his chest as if she weighed nothing, as if the months of physical training had all been preparation for this single moment of perfect strength. Emma wrapped her legs around his waist and her arms around his neck, clinging to him like he might evaporate if she didn't hold tight enough. "I missed you. I missed you. I missed you," she chanted into his neck, the words tumbling out between sobs. "I saved you, dessert, every night. I saved you, desert, and I kept your pillow warm, and I told your picture about my days, but pictures don't talk back, and I wanted you to talk back, and baby, I'm here now." Michael's voice was muffled against her hair, which still smelled like strawberry shampoo, despite 9 months of growth. "I'm here! I'm here! I'm never leaving again." It was a promise he had no right to make. Military families never knew what tomorrow would bring, but in this moment, wrapped in his daughter's desperate embrace, it felt like the only truth that mattered. Around them, the airport had become a gallery of witnesses. Phones were out, recording, but respectfully distant. A woman in a business suit openly wept while pretending to read emails. An elderly man removed his baseball cap and held it over his heart. 2 teenagers, normally immune to sentiment, stood transfixed, tears streaming down their faces as they watched love overcome geography and time. Even the TSA agents had paused their duties, standing at their posts with softened expressions, remembering their own children, their own separations, their own moments when the world narrowed down to nothing but the person you'd been missing. Sarah approached slowly, her own tears falling in steady streams. She'd orchestrated this moment, had spent weeks planning every detail. but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of watching her broken family become whole again. When Michael's free arm reached for her, she melted into them both, creating a circle that had been incomplete for too long. They stayed like that, the three of them, crying and laughing and holding each other in the middle of Gate 12, while an entire airport remembered what it felt like to witness pure, undiluted love. Time had stopped, geography had surrendered, and for these precious minutes, war and separation and worry ceased to exist. There was only this: a father, a mother, a daughter, and the unbreakable bonds that had stretched across continents, but had never, not once, come close to breaking.